For advice for all the family, get expert care nationwide. Life Pharmacy sponsors Nationwide.
On Nationwide this evening, a history of the tapestry of the peoples who live in the southeast. We look back on the history of the Norman invasion, the establishment of the city of Waterford. We visit castles and houses from the period which have survived. Plus, from more recent history, the story of a family who came from England almost 400 settled in County Wexford. The modern ports of Waterford at Bellevue and at Wexford's Rosslare are the gateways for freight from Britain and the continent. For centuries, these counties have been on the front line of a wave of arrivals and departures down the generations. This evening, we are looking back through the centuries for a flavour of the peoples who came and who conquered and settled in this part of Ireland. Over 850 years ago, one of the most significant marriages in Irish history took place in the city of Waterford, between the Anglo-Norman knight Strongbow and the Irish princess Aoife. The Waterford Museum of Treasures commissioned a film to recreate that wedding.
So he readied himself for revenge and started looking for an army to help him reclaim his rightful throne.
What of it? What do a few dead peasants mean to me?
So I see you have the stomach for this.
You still need my consent.
Did you see how easily these Normans took Wexford? MacReinald's head will be mine for his betrayal.
My lord, are you here today of your own free will and choice?
I am.
So today we're filming the reenactment of one of the most important marriages in Irish history. So those not just from Waterford but nationally will know of the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, which took place right where we're standing at the moment actually, at the site of the current Christchurch Cathedral on the 25th of August 1170, and we've approached a very significant anniversary for them. And 50th wedding anniversary of the marriage that we like to say here changed the course of history on this island.
I love this part of the city. I'm surrounded by history.
So in previous years we have had the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife and we have done that reenactment, but seeing as we are right in the middle of the decade of centenaries, we decided to actually base the production in the 1920s on the 750th in centuries. And we have Mrs. Rickards, who was the housekeeper of the Bishop's Palace, which is just behind us here in the cathedral, and she is right here on and realises that it's the 750th wedding anniversary.
In the year 1170, the most important marriage in Irish history took place. The union of the Anglo-Norman the Irish Princess Aoife.
Okay. The original plan was to have the performance here on Cathedral Square on that exact day of the marriage on the 25th of August, so 850 years later. As we all know, times have changed. It wasn't only our wedding was affected here as well, along with a lot of other people's here in the country. So we've decided actually to film it. So we're going to film it and it's going to be available online, which we're hoping actually will be able to reach a much broader audience, a much more diverse audience, and will be able to be shared not only locally, nationally, but maybe even globally, and teach people about and share with people such an important moment in the history of our island here.
We are gathered here today to celebrate not only the union of this man and woman of two noble families, but the joining of two peoples under God in recognition of the everlasting relationship between two kingdoms.
Being the 850th anniversary, this year we really wanted to go much further than we ever had before, and we wanted to give each of our main characters, being Aoife, Strongbow and Diarmid, real characterizations. So when we started researching it, we found some very interesting things early on, and particularly with regard to Strongbow and Diarmid, because there was a real sort of undercurrent of similarity there. So we sort of, Diarmuid of course has just lost his throne. He's lost more or less everything, and he's been a very powerful man his entire life. Strongbow of course has also lost everything, and the two of them have lost their livelihoods and their lands and everything as a result of backing the wrong side. So there was probably a definite mutual understanding and respect there between those two men, which probably underpinned this whole relationship that they had.
Ah, Diarmuid MacMurrough, the exiled king of Leinster. Well, the beggar king has taken to calling you around here. I did wonder when your shadow would darken my door.
I did not come here, declare, to be insulted by a man who was stripped of his title 10 years ago.
One of the things that we were really keen to get right when we set out to do this production in the first place was to, for the first time, give Aoife a real character. I mean, we of course would have done a reenactment of this marriage several times over the last few years, and Aoife's always just been there. And obviously if you look at that painting by Daniel McAleese, which we all know, up in the National Gallery, she's this very sort of submissive character. She doesn't even look Strongbow in the eye during their wedding. So we wanted to sort of be a bit more realistic about what she would have been like. So Aoife is the daughter of Diarmuid's second wife. She's in a very different position to his older children. And as well as that, she was definitely probably quite a cunning woman herself.
Terriblina O'Hin, you left us 4 years ago, left us to fend for ourselves.
She would have seen the sort of ambitious nature of her father and probably attempted to emulate it herself, because as a daughter of a second wife, she wouldn't have had exactly the same opportunities, but she would have been very, very educated. So we think that as a Brehon lady who would have had to consent to this marriage, she could not be forced into it. Her and the sort of things that she could have progressed onto through that position of power.
It is a good match.
I am not a pawn.
Oh, Aoife, tá is a gan mertiging nach ra banish riamh mar seo an éireann. We both know that a wedding like this has never taken place in our land.
Well, I suppose the background to the siege of 1170 actually begins around 1166, and that's when Diarmuid MacMurrough is deposed from his throne for the first time, because of course this is a very different political environment to what came afterwards. So this is under Brehon law, of course, and we have a number of kingdoms across Ireland. Some of them are more powerful than others. Diarmuid, as King of Leinster, would have been one of the more powerful ones, but he was a warlord, and he was very much a wartime king, and he would have made quite a few enemies for himself as a result. So very, very often. So there's a lot of political instability there. Well, I suppose a lot of people, particularly because of Daniel McAleese's painting, it's been seen as a very sort of romantic chapter in Waterford's history, even though they were, of course, married in the direct aftermath of a very, very bloody siege. And it's this really interesting sequence of events that happens that day. Now, the only source we have for it, of course, is Gerald of Wales. And in the space of one very long sentence, he sort of tells us about this one day where Strongbow lands at Wexford. He makes his way to Waterford. They lay siege to the city, decimated entirely very, very quickly. And then he sends for Diarmuid. They arrive that same afternoon. He marries Aoife and has the King of Waterford, Sitrick, put to death in Reginald's Tower. So it's this really dramatic event.
And after 750 years, here I am, another English soldier in this land. And I think people like to experience history in new ways now. For a lot of people, reading books just doesn't really cut it. Whereas if you can see it in the flesh, you can actually hear it and almost feel it. It just brings history to life, especially for the youngsters.
I have read that marriage changed the course of this island's for the centuries that were to follow. It's a very different way of learning history compared to how we were taught history when I was a child. It's also interactive and new, and people really, really take to it, and they retain an awful lot of the information then in that way.
As a museum, our entire role is to help the public engage with their own heritage and with history. With this level of sponsorship, to literally bring a project like this to life and to explore a side of it that we haven't ever gotten the chance to before is really wonderful, and particularly to have the chance to have actors, I suppose, go through the whole thing and make it this production that we can use for several things going forward. I mean, we can put it through in education programs, we can sort of show it here in the museum, and we are going to share it on our social media as well. And we hope that, I mean, people will see a real different side to this marriage, something aside from what they would know from Daniel McAleese's painting, sort of just a really human side to this whole thing.
Then, by the power vested in me, by our Lord God and the Holy Spirit, I now pronounce you husband and wife.
And you can watch the recreation of the marriage of Strongbow and Princess Aoife on the website on screen now. And that marriage really did change the history of Ireland. Hi, Catherine. I've come here to St. Dubhans on the Hook Peninsula to meet archaeologist Catherine McLaughlin. Catherine, we just saw there the marriage of Strongbow and Princess Aoife. What kind of legacy did that leave on the landscape and the history of Ireland?
Well, there was a huge legacy created by that marriage. Aoife's father was Dermot McMurrough, King of Leinster, and when Aoife married Strongbow, the legacy continued through Aoife's daughter Isabel, who then married William Marshall. And through those alliances and marriages, there was a huge legacy on the political, social, architectural history of Ireland, and we can see that very much in the built architecture of what we see today.
So the Normans had a huge influence, as you say, on the architecture of the sites in Ireland. Did they recreate or did they create their own buildings?
Well, they did both, Blonnet, actually, a very interesting observation. So, as I say, this is St. Dubhans, and if we look at this church, we can see that we have a nave on this end and a chancel on this end. What we're standing here at the chancel end, this was added by the Anglo-Normans. Some sites were completely built when the Anglo-Normans got here, for example, Bannow Church. And of course, the great castle building phase of the Anglo-Norman masonry castles in the early 13th century was very much an Anglo-Norman expansion phase. So there's a lot in the built heritage.
So Catherine, we've come out to church here, and this was originally an Anglo-Norman build.
Blonnet, it was indeed. This is an Anglo-Norman church which was in the middle of a medieval town. The medieval town doesn't exist any longer. This is the only standing remains of that town, and it dates to the Anglo-Norman invasion.
How does that legacy then sort of translate into tourism?
Basically, all our beautiful medieval monuments really inform a sense of place about, you know, the culture and where we live and what we're all about. So this lovely church and many of the other medieval monuments in St. Dubhans and St. Mary's and New Ross, they're all on the Norman Way, which is Wexford County Council's flagship new tourism trail to highlight.
We're going to take a break. When we return, the story of a family who came to Ireland almost 400 years ago. Stay with us.
For health advice to stay well, get expert care nationwide. Life Pharmacy sponsors Nationwide.
Didn't she?
Final answer.
No. I just tried to be
Craig David.
entertaining. And to get the questions right.
Quiz concludes. Sunday at 9:30 on RTÉ One, and all episodes available on RTÉ Player now.
At Liberty Insurance, we wondered...
Car insurance. What's important for you?
I always go third party. Kind of boring, but you've got backup, you've got cover.
Windscreen cover is very important as well.
Breakdown assistance would be most important for us.
Inside cars are a mystery, Jimmy.
Well, I can't even fix a tyre.
Liberty Insurance puts you in the driving seat. Only pay for what you need at libertyinsurance.ie.
It's good to have that choice that we can pick and choose.
Take control with Liberty Insurance.
Ready for the real world!
Staying close to home is how we live every day right now. So know that at Centra, we have everything you need. Like delicious, convenient meals, fresh bakery, a brilliant wine selection, and great offers. Like Centra Stillwater 9-pack 5.60, Centra Homestyle Oven Chips 1.5 kilo, now only €1.40. And Centra Dishwasher Tablets 5-in-1 Lemon 30-pack, now only €1.55. Centra, live every day.
Every one of us is still at risk from COVID-19. But every time we do the right thing, and the people around us, So remember, we all need to take a step back. Let's make an extra effort to keep cleaning those hands and wear a face covering when you're shopping or on public transport. If you sneeze or cough, cover it or have a tissue handy. And download the COVID Tracker app to help reduce the spread of the virus, because COVID-19 is still a problem and we're all the answer.
At Electric Ireland, we're here to support over 1 million homes and businesses, because we're brighter together.
It's match day, and sometimes things don't go your way. But William Hill gives you the freedom to choose by giving you the rules of the game. Now take the field. Take limits. Take a break. Own your game, so you'll always play your best game. Gamble responsibly. William Hill.
For advice on skin care, get expert care nationwide. Life Pharmacy sponsors Nationwide.
This evening we are in the stories of settlers who came to this part of Ireland hundreds of years ago. As we saw in part one, these peoples, Viking, Norman and English, came, battled, settled, intermarried, and today their descendants are very much part of the fabric of this country, with old castles and homesteads dotted around the Kilkenny, Waterford and Wexford countryside. The 1920s was a turbulent time in Ireland, and it was against this backdrop that Helen Boxwell Screen was born in Wexford. Her family were Anglo-Irish and they lived a few miles outside of Wexford in a place called Butler's Town Castle. Helen has written her family history.
Helen Screen enjoys her regular visits to see her friend Maeve Davison in nearby Bargy Castle. Both women are 94 years old and have much in common. They love horses and were accomplished riders, and they've both worked abroad. Helen has brought a copy of her new book, The Boxwells of Butler's Town Castle. It's the story of Helen's ancestors, who came to settle in Wexford from England over 350 years ago. The baronies of Fortin Bargy, where both ladies live, are often referred to as the English baronies, and many of the people who live there are descendants from Anglo-Norman, Flemish and English settlers. And they even had their own dialect called Yola.
Our gentries were bibron amzil kunustone. Yet muslar had bahold, it was by we Tommy that by me's look was in pit to drive in. Jowd and Maud Vram Chieta was a lock, zich Faprin and Shimrin Fanny da. Zich Blankin and Blaine, Fanny Ball was a draw, shot wall or aim was to use ne'er a blow.
The Boxwells were originally from Wootton Bassett in Wiltshire.
I think the Boxwells came to Ireland around 1670 and settled here, proliferated to some extent, and are still here.
Helen describes herself as Anglo-Irish, and her upbringing in the 20s and 30s reflects that background.
I was born in Wexford.
So you're a Wexford woman?
Yes, I'm a Wexford woman. We had employees who did the rough work on the farm.
And what did you farm?
Cattle and calves, you know, and sold them and so on. We had pigs and we had horses. My family employed a governess for a short time for me. And then I went to Alexandra College in Dublin and took my school cert and all that. And then I went to Trinity for a year, but my father died and there was a money shortage here, so I didn't complete a degree. I went off to London and got a job there.
Helen Boxwell met her future husband John Screen when he visited her family in Butlerstown.
And I married a man who was an Englishman who worked in Malaysia. And I joined him there. We married, and we were very happy together. Well, he was a cousin of the Screens in North Wexford, who were sort of friends of ours, not intimate friends, but we all hunted together. And so that's how we met. And he came to visit us because he'd been in Malaysia, where my sister was, and he came to call on us. And he said he was on his way to England. Oh, I said, how funny, because I'm going to England tomorrow. Oh, he said, so am I, so we'll go together. So that's how we got together. And had a nice time going over, stopped, had lunch on the side of a hill in Wales, and it went on from there.
Helen is the second youngest in her family and the only one of her generation still alive today. Helen's daughter, Anna Screen Brunton, who lives at Butlerstown Castle, knew that her mother was recording, and she encouraged her to publish the story of the Boxwells of Butlerstown Castle.
About 2 years ago, I thought, I don't think she's ever going to finish it. And there were about 4 different versions. So I thought, I'll get going on it. And I put it together and made it as one. And then just before the lockdown, by serendipity, I would say divine timing, I met Michael Freeman, who is this amazing publisher. And he took one look at it and he said, you're on, but there's a huge amount of work to do. Putting in all the bits that were missing and people that came down through different lines that I wanted to really add into the book as well. I would agree it's absolutely an Anglo-Irish life that I grew up in, and that particularly actually that my mother grew up in, because even though they had been brought up here, very much this was home. England was not home, this was home, but there were many connections with England, and many of them had to go abroad in order to earn their living. What they had enough living to be able to actually fund a place like this, because there was never a huge amount of land in certainly my mother's generation and my generation. There's not been enough land to make this into to have a big enough farm to really be able to fund looking after this house alone, let alone, just living.
The 1920s were turbulent times in Ireland. Many of the big houses were burnt down, and some Anglo-Irish families decided to leave this country. Helen believes it was her mother's kindness and generosity that prevented any harm befalling the Boxwells.
She did whatever she could for the people that were suffering a bit, who lived up the road. Some of them had big families and very little income. And she employed a couple of people on the farm. So she was very sympathetic to that. She'd been orphaned as a youngster, so that she had great sympathy with people who were in their lives. I don't think we did anything to encourage people to do us any harm. I think we were friendly with our neighbours. And My mother helped, and my father, but he was less, he was more an intellectual really. He'd spent his working life in India, where they had lots of people helping out, you know, and so he was very sympathetic to people that were in need of one thing or another, and she did her best for them. And I know there were occasions when people came and slept in the hayloft because it was a nice place to sleep, nice and warm, comfortable, and stay very long, but it got them over perhaps a crisis in their lives.
Helen has seen huge changes in Ireland over the past 90 years.
Everybody's independent now. Oh, if they're not independent, they get a bit of help. But they don't get any help from us, they don't need it. We have friends who live in cottages up the road and they're all okay. And they get jobs and they work. And that's, thank goodness for that. Ireland's a happier place than it used to be.
The Boxwells loved their music, and Helen wouldn't let us leave of a famous Wexford song.
The Boxwells of Butler's Town Castle is a fascinating story about an Anglo-Irish family. And indeed, that story brings us to the end of our programme, the tapestry of the peoples of the South East. Sin deire leis a glór bigí slán agus sábhailte. On Wednesdays nationwide, the craft of crafting. We meet people who, despite the pandemic, are crafting away in rural areas of the country and who need our business.
And that's on the way on Wednesday at 7. Tonight, 2 instructors have the unenviable task of teaching their own kids to drive on the test, on the way in an hour. But next up, Aonghus McGreana talks about the influence his mother had on his life in Sisa Chahir.
For those little sniffles and